Fyodor Dostoevsky was not a philosopher in the classical academic sense. He did not construct a tightly organized system of concepts, did not name any formal doctrine, and did not present his ideas in philosophical treatises like Kant or Marx. However, this does not mean that Dostoevsky lacked philosophy. On the contrary, his philosophy exists on a deeper level. It lives within human beings. Rather than writing philosophy through abstract concepts, Dostoevsky wrote philosophy through novels. He placed humanity's most fundamental questions about freedom, guilt, faith, suffering, and the meaning of life into the lived experiences of his characters. Each character is not merely an individual, but a living ideological position, struggling, colliding, and often collapsing under its own weight. At the center of Dostoevsky's philosophy lies inner conflict. His characters are constantly torn between reason and instinct, morality and desire, faith and nihilism. There are no easy answers and no complete reconciliations. It is precisely this tension that defines what it means to be human in Dostoevsky's world. Another essential element is moral, religious, and psychological dialogue. Dostoevsky does not preach. Instead, he allows his characters to argue, challenge, and even deny one another. Through these confrontations, the reader is forced to face a disturbing question. If there is no absolute moral foundation, what prevents human beings from committing evil? Therefore, when we speak of Dostoevsky's philosophy, we are not referring to a closed or systematic doctrine, but to an ongoing dialogue about human nature. His philosophy does not offer comfort or certainty. It demands reflection, doubt, and personal responsibility for one's own conclusions. In the following section, we will examine the core philosophical pillars that emerge throughout Dostoevsky's works, ideas he never states explicitly, yet repeatedly brings to life through his characters, their suffering, and their moral choices. These are the foundations that give Dostoevsky's writing its enduring philosophical weight and its lasting influence on modern thought.
Humans are both noble and sinful. 1. Human nature as a paradox, greatness and depravity. At the heart of Dostoevsky's philosophy lies a deeply unsettling idea. Human beings are inherently paradoxical. We are capable of extraordinary compassion, sacrifice, and moral courage, yet at the same time capable of cruelty, selfishness, and moral collapse. Dostoevsky rejects any simplified view of human nature that frames people as either fundamentally good or irredeemably evil. Instead, he insists that both extremes coexist within the same individual. In Crime and Punishment, this paradox is embodied in the character of Raskolnikov. He is intelligent, sensitive, and deeply concerned with suffering, yet he commits a brutal murder. Dostoevsky does not portray this contradiction as accidental or abnormal. Rather, it reflects a universal truth. The same person who longs to do good may also rationalize acts of immense harm. For Dostoevsky, human greatness is not found in moral purity, but in moral struggle. The capacity for love, empathy, and self-sacrifice exists precisely because humans are also capable of falling. Without the possibility of sin, virtue would be meaningless. This is why Dostoevsky's characters are never static moral symbols. They are dynamic beings constantly oscillating between opposing impulses. This view directly challenges Enlightenment optimism, which held that reason and education could perfect human behavior. Dostoevsky believed such thinking ignored the darker, irrational dimensions of the human psyche. He understood that moral awareness does not eliminate temptation, it intensifies it. Knowing what is right does not prevent wrongdoing. It merely deepens the internal conflict. Thus, Dostoevsky presents human nature as tragic but profound. Our greatness lies not in being free from evil, but in confronting it within ourselves. The tension between nobility and sin is not a flaw in humanity. It is a defining feature of what it means to be human. 2. The limits of reason in controlling human desire. One of Dostoevsky's most radical claims is that reason alone is insufficient to govern human behavior. While reason may explain, justify, or calculate, it cannot fully restrain instinct, desire, or obsession. In fact, Dostoevsky often suggests that reason can become a tool for justifying evil rather than preventing it. Raskolnikov's crime is not an impulsive act driven by raw emotion. It is carefully planned, intellectually defended, and philosophically justified. He convinces himself that murder can be morally permissible if committed for a higher purpose. This is precisely what terrifies Dostoevsky. When reason is severed from humility and moral responsibility, it becomes dangerous. Dostoevsky challenges the assumption that humans act rationally in pursuit of self-interest. Instead, he portrays individuals who knowingly act against their own well-being, sabotaging their happiness out of pride, resentment, or desire to assert control. Human beings do not merely want comfort or safety. They want to feel powerful, autonomous, and exceptional, even at great personal cost. This insight anticipates modern psychology. Dostoevsky understood that unconscious drives, emotional wounds, and suppressed desires often override rational calculation. Reason may provide explanations, but it rarely governs behavior completely. When people claim to act logically, they are often disguising deeper emotional motives. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov's intellectual theories collapse under the weight of guilt and psychological torment. His suffering reveals a truth Dostoevsky considered fundamental. The human soul cannot be reduced to equations. Any worldview that treats people as predictable, rational machines will ultimately fail, because it misunderstands the chaotic reality of human desire. 3. Crime is a moral experiment. Dostoevsky does not treat crime merely as a legal or social issue. In Crime and Punishment, crime becomes a philosophical experiment, an attempt to test the limits of morality, freedom, and human self-justification. Raskolnikov does not kill out of necessity. He kills to prove an idea. He believes that extraordinary individuals have the right to transgress moral laws if their actions serve a greater good. This theory reflects a dangerous temptation, the desire to place oneself above moral constraints. Dostoevsky exposes how seductive this idea can be, especially for intelligent and alienated individuals. However, the experiment fails. Raskolnikov's punishment begins long before his arrest. His mind fractures, his isolation deepens, and his sense of identity collapses. Dostoevsky demonstrates that moral laws are not merely external rules imposed by society. They are internal structures embedded within the human conscience. Crime, in Dostoevsky's worldview, is not punished solely by institutions, but by the soul itself. The attempt to escape moral responsibility leads not to liberation, but to psychological imprisonment. This is why Dostoevsky's concept of punishment is fundamentally existential rather than legal. Through Raskolnikov, Dostoevsky warns that ideas of consequences, abstract theories, when acted upon without compassion or humility, can destroy the individual who embraces them. Crime becomes a stage upon which the illusion of moral superiority collapses. For guilt, suffering, and the awakening of conscience. For Dostoevsky, guilt is not merely a negative emotion. It is a signal of moral awareness. Suffering, though agonizing, plays a crucial role in awakening conscience and restoring humanity. Raskolnikov's torment is not meaningless. It is transformative. Dostoevsky believed that suffering exposes the false narratives people tell themselves. Raskolnikov initially views himself as superior, rational, and justified. Yet guilt relentlessly dismantles his self-image. His suffering forces him to confront his own vulnerability and moral failure. This view sharply contrasts with philosophies that regard suffering as purely pathological or unnecessary. Dostoevsky does not glorify pain, but he recognizes its revelatory power. Without suffering, self-deception can persist indefinitely. Through characters like Sonia, Dostoevsky presents compassion as the counterforce to guilt. She does not excuse Raskolnikov's crime, but she refuses to abandon him. Her love demonstrates that redemption does not come through intellectual arguments, but through shared suffering and moral solidarity. In this way, Dostoevsky frames guilt and suffering as painful gateways to moral rebirth. They strip away arrogance and reconnect individuals with their humanity. 5. Redemption through acceptance of moral responsibility. The ultimate resolution of crime and punishment is not found in legal punishment, but in Raskolnikov's acceptance of moral responsibility. Redemption begins only when he stops defending his theory and acknowledges his guilt, not abstractly, but personally. Dostoevsky insists that true redemption requires humility. One must abandon the desire to stand above others and accept equality in guilt and vulnerability. This is a profoundly anti-elitist moral vision. No one is exempt from moral law, regardless of intelligence or intention. Redemption, for Dostoevsky, is not instant. It is a slow, painful process rooted in honesty, repentance, and connection with others. It does not erase the crime, but it restores the possibility of meaning. In portraying this journey, Dostoevsky affirms his central belief: human beings are neither angels nor demons. We are capable of great evil, but also profound moral recovery. It is this tension, not its resolution, that defines human dignity. Freedom, God, and the danger of moral absolutes. 1. Freedom as a burden, not a gift. For Dostoevsky, freedom is not a purely positive ideal. Unlike many Enlightenment thinkers who celebrated freedom as the ultimate human good, Dostoevsky saw it as a terrifying burden. To be free is not simply to choose what one desires, but to bear full responsibility for those choices, without excuses, guarantees, or external authorities to hide behind. His characters often long for freedom, yet collapse under its weight. They want autonomy, but fear the consequences of acting without moral certainty. This contradiction reveals a core Dostoevskian insight. Human beings crave freedom in theory, but resist it in practice. True freedom, in Dostoevsky's view, demands moral courage. It requires individuals to confront guilt, uncertainty, and the possibility of being wrong. Many people would rather surrender their freedom to systems, ideologies, or authorities that promise security and moral clarity. This is why Dostoevsky repeatedly portrays freedom as destabilizing rather than liberating. Without an internal moral compass, freedom becomes chaos. Individuals begin to rationalize cruelty, justify violence, and deny responsibility for their actions. Dostoevsky's warning is clear. Freedom without moral grounding does not elevate humanity, it fractures it. Freedom is meaningful only when it is paired with responsibility, conscience, and humility. 2. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. This famous line from the Brothers Karamazov encapsulates one of Dostoevsky's most unsettling ideas. It does not function as a slogan for atheism or religion, but as a philosophical challenge. If there is no absolute moral foundation, what ultimately restrains human behavior? Dostoevsky does not claim that atheists are moral. Rather, he questions whether purely rational or social ethics can sustain moral limits under extreme conditions. When moral rules are reduced to conventions or calculations, they can be rewritten, suspended, or ignored. In Dostoevsky's world, the danger lies not in disbelief itself, but in moral relativism, the belief that good and evil are negotiable. Once moral boundaries become flexible, power replaces conscience as the ultimate authority. This idea appears repeatedly in characters who justify violence for the greater good. Without a transcendent reference point, morality becomes instrumental. Evil is no longer evil. It is merely necessary. Dostoevsky's concern is psychological as much as theological. He understood that humans are adept at self-justification. If there is no higher moral witness, God, conscience, or sacred value, then nothing truly prevents individuals from placing themselves above others. 3. The Grand Inquisitor, security over freedom. Nowhere is Dostoevsky's critique of freedom more powerful than in the parable of the Grand Inquisitor. Here, Dostoevsky presents a chilling argument. Most people do not want freedom. They want security, certainty, and bread. The Inquisitor accuses Christ of burdening humanity with freedom. According to him, humans are weak, fearful creatures who prefer obedience over responsibility. Give them freedom, and they will beg to surrender it. This parable exposes a disturbing truth. Systems that promise happiness and order often demand the sacrifice of individual conscience. People accept this trade willingly, as long as they are relieved of moral responsibility. Dostoevsky foresaw the rise of authoritarian ideologies that justify oppression in the name of collective well-being. The Grand Inquisitor does not rule through cruelty alone, but through psychological insight into human weakness. The message is brutal but clear. The greatest threat to freedom is not tyranny imposed from above, but surrender from below. For rational utopias and moral violence. Dostoevsky deeply distrusted utopian visions built on pure reason. He believed that attempts to engineer perfect societies inevitably lead to moral violence, because they treat human beings as means rather than ends. When happiness is defined statistically or collectively, individual suffering becomes acceptable. Someone must suffer for the system to function, and reason will always find a justification. Dostoevsky recognized that moral atrocities are often committed not out of hatred, but out of conviction. People commit evil most efficiently when they believe they're doing good. This is why Dostoevsky places so much emphasis on the individual conscience. No system, ideology, or theory can replace personal moral responsibility. Once morality is outsourced, violence becomes impersonal, and therefore limitless. 5. Faith as moral orientation, not blind belief. Dostoevsky's defense of faith is often misunderstood as dogmatic. In reality, his concept of faith is not blind obedience to doctrine, but a moral orientation rooted in humility and love. Faith, for Dostoevsky, restrains human arrogance. It reminds individuals that they are not the ultimate judges of good and evil. This humility prevents the rise of moral absolutism disguised as rational progress. Importantly, Dostoevsky does not deny doubt. His most faithful characters struggle deeply with belief. Faith is not certainty. It is commitment despite uncertainty. In this sense, faith functions as a safeguard against moral nihilism. It preserves the dignity of each individual and limits the human tendency to dominate others in the name of reason or progress. Nihilism, meaning in the struggle to affirm life. 1. Nihilism as the collapse of meaning. For Dostoevsky, nihilism is not merely a philosophical position. It is a psychological and spiritual catastrophe. Nihilism emerges when traditional sources of meaning, such as faith, moral absolutes, and shared values, are dismantled without being replaced by anything capable of sustaining the human soul. Dostoevsky witnessed the rise of nihilistic thinking in 19th century Russia, particularly among young intellectuals who rejected religion, tradition, and moral authority in the name of reason and progress. While he sympathized with their desire for justice and truth, he feared the consequences of tearing down meaning without understanding what would fill the void. In Dostoevsky's novels, nihilism does not produce liberation. It produces disorientation, despair, and moral paralysis. Characters who embrace nihilism often lose their ability to distinguish good from evil, not because they are cruel, but because nothing feels real or binding anymore. This loss of meaning does not lead to neutrality. It leads to extremes. Without moral anchors, individuals oscillate between apathy and fanaticism. Life becomes either empty or expendable. Dostoevsky understood that humans cannot live without meaning. When meaning disappears, something destructive rushes in to replace it. Thus, nihilism is not freedom from illusion. It is erosion of the very structures that make human life bearable. 2. Ivan Karamazov and the intellectual face of nihilism. Ivan Karamazov represents the most sophisticated and troubling form of nihilism in Dostoevsky's work. He is not reckless or immoral in intention. He is intelligent, compassionate, and deeply disturbed by suffering, especially the suffering of innocent children. Ivan's rebellion is moral, not selfish. He cannot accept a universe in which innocent suffering is justified by divine harmony. As a result, he rejects God, not out of arrogance, but out of ethical outrage. Yet Dostoevsky shows that Ivan's rejection does not lead to peace. It leads to fragmentation. Ivan's intellect dismantles faith, but it cannot construct meaning in its place. His famous declaration, "Everything is permitted," is not a celebration but a warning. Ivan's tragedy lies in the gap between moral sensitivity and existential grounding. He feels the weight of injustice deeply, yet lacks a framework that can sustain moral responsibility without collapsing into despair. Through Ivan, Dostoevsky demonstrates that nihilism often begins with compassion, but ends in isolation. The intellect alone cannot bear the burden of meaning. 3. Nihilism and the temptation of destruction. One of Dostoevsky's most disturbing insights is that nihilism often expresses itself through destruction. When life feels meaningless, the impulse to destroy oneself, others, or society can appear seductive. In Demons, Dostoevsky portrays revolutionary nihilists who justify violence as historical necessity. Their cruelty is not driven by hatred, but by emptiness. When nothing has intrinsic value, destruction becomes morally neutral or even purposeful. Dostoevsky understood that nihilism erodes the sanctity of the individual. Human beings become symbols, obstacles, or tools. Violence becomes abstract, detached from concrete suffering. This insight proved prophetic. Dostoevsky anticipated the ideological violence of the 20th century, where mass suffering was justified in the name of progress, equality, or historical inevitability. Nihilism, in this sense, is not passive despair. It is active negation. It denies not only meaning, but the moral uniqueness of each human life. 4. The human need to affirm life despite absurdity. Despite his relentless exploration of darkness, Dostoevsky is not a nihilist. He insists that the human spirit longs to affirm life, even when it appears irrational, unjust, or absurd. This affirmation is not based on optimism or denial. It arises from the recognition that life's value cannot be proven logically, yet must be lived as if it matters. Dostoevsky anticipates existentialist themes later developed by Camus and others, but with a crucial difference. For Dostoevsky, affirmation is inseparable from moral responsibility and compassion. To affirm life is not a claim that life is fair. It is to choose not to abandon it. This choice is fragile, costly, and deeply personal. In Dostoevsky's world, meaning is not discovered, it is enacted. It is created through love, responsibility, and suffering willingly borne. 5. Meaning as commitment, not certainty. Dostoevsky rejects the idea that meaning requires certainty. Faith for him does not eliminate doubt. It coexists with it. Meaning is not a conclusion reached through argument, but a commitment sustained through struggle. This is why Dostoevsky's characters often believe and doubt simultaneously. Their faith is not intellectual comfort, but moral orientation. Meaning, in this sense, is not something one possesses. It is something one lives, often imperfectly. Dostoevsky's ultimate challenge to nihilism is not a proof of God, but a demand for responsibility. If life has no guaranteed meaning, will you still act as if every human being matters? This question remains unresolved, and intentionally so. Dostoevsky leaves a reader not with answers, but with a burden. The burden of choosing meaning in a world that offers none easily. Responsibility, love, and the moral ideal of the human being. 1. Radical personal responsibility. At the core of Dostoevsky's moral vision lies a demand that is both simple and unbearable: absolute personal responsibility. Dostoevsky rejects every attempt to shift moral blame onto systems, ideologies, historical forces, or psychological explanations. For him, no theory can absolve the individual from responsibility for their actions. This idea is expressed most clearly in the Brothers Karamazov through the teaching that everyone is responsible for everyone. This statement is not meant as a political slogan, but as a moral provocation. It insists that the individual cannot retreat into innocence by claiming powerlessness. Dostoevsky understood how deeply humans desire moral escape. We seek explanations that transform guilt into inevitability and responsibility into circumstance. Yet Dostoevsky insists that this escape destroys moral agency itself. Radical responsibility does not mean omnipotence. It does not deny social injustice or suffering imposed by others. Rather, it asserts that even within constraint, the individual retains moral freedom, the freedom to respond. For Dostoevsky, dignity begins where excuses end. To accept responsibility is to affirm oneself as a moral being capable of choice, even under tragic conditions. 2. Love is the highest moral act. Dostoevsky does not define love sentimentally. Love, in his philosophy, is not emotion or attraction. It is action, sacrifice, and presence. To love another person is to accept responsibility for their suffering without demanding justification or reward. Characters like Alyosha Karamazov embody this form of love. He does not dominate, instruct, or manipulate. He listens, suffers alongside others, and refuses to reduce people to their worst actions. This form of love is radically anti-utilitarian. It does not aim to maximize happiness or efficiency. It values the individual not because of usefulness, virtue, or potential, but because they exist. Dostoevsky believed that abstract love for humanity often masks indifference to real people. True love is concrete, difficult, and often unrewarding. It involves patience, humility, and endurance. In this sense, love becomes the highest moral act, not because it feels good, but because it resists dehumanization. It affirms the irreplaceable value of each person, even the broken and guilty. 3. The moral ideal: humility over greatness. Unlike many philosophical traditions that celebrate strength, mastery, or intellectual superiority, Dostoevsky's moral ideal is grounded in humility. He distrusts moral heroes who stand above others. Dostoevsky's greatest characters do not dominate the world. They kneel within it. They reject the desire to be exceptional and instead accept equality in guilt and vulnerability. This humility is not weakness. It requires immense courage to renounce moral superiority and accept one's own fallibility. Dostoevsky understood that the most dangerous people are those who believe themselves morally justified. Humility restrains cruelty. It prevents individuals from sacrificing others for ideals, systems, or visions of progress. By acknowledging one's own capacity for evil, one becomes less eager to condemn. Thus, Dostoevsky's moral ideal is not the flawless individual, but the honest one, the person who recognizes their darkness and refuses to project it onto others. 4. Community through shared moral burden. Dostoevsky does not envision salvation as an individual achievement. Moral life, in his view, is fundamentally communal. Humans are bound together not by shared success, but by shared moral burden. Suffering isolates when borne alone. Shared suffering creates community. This is why Dostoevsky emphasizes confession, forgiveness, and mutual responsibility. Community, for Dostoevsky, is not built on agreement or ideology, but on recognition of shared fragility. When individuals stop pretending to be morally superior, genuine solidarity becomes possible. This vision stands in contrast to both authoritarian collectivism and radical individualism. Dostoevsky rejects systems that erase the individual, but he also rejects the fantasy of self-sufficiency. True community arises when individuals willingly carry responsibility for one another, not by force, but by conscience. 5. The affirmation of life through moral choice. Dostoevsky's final answer to nihilism is not proof, certainty, or utopia. It is moral choice. In a world where meaning is fragile and suffering unavoidable, the human task is not to solve existence, but to affirm it through action. To affirm life, in Dostoevsky's sense, is to choose responsibility over escape, love over indifference, humility over domination. These choices do not eliminate tragedy, but they prevent despair from having the final word. Dostoevsky offers no guarantees. Redemption is possible, not promised. Meaning is created, not secured. Faith is lived, not proven. This is why his philosophy remains unsettling. It leaves the reader alone with their freedom and their responsibility. In the end, Dostoevsky's moral ideal is not a perfect human being, but a morally awake one. Someone who knows the weight of existence and chooses to bear it without surrendering their humanity. Suffering is a path to truth. One of the most unsettling ideas in Dostoevsky's work is also one of the most persistent. Suffering is not an accident of human life, but one of its deepest teachers. In a modern world obsessed with comfort, efficiency, and happiness, this idea feels almost offensive. We are taught to minimize pain, to escape discomfort, to optimize life so that suffering becomes a technical problem to be solved. If something hurts, something must be wrong. If life is painful, it must be fixed. Dostoevsky disagreed radically. For him, suffering was not merely something to be endured or eliminated. It was something that revealed, something that stripped away illusions, something that forced human beings to confront themselves without disguise. This does not mean Dostoevsky glorified pain. He was no romantic of misery. His novels are filled with unbearable suffering, poverty, illness, humiliation, abuse, guilt, and despair. But he consistently returns to one troubling insight. Without suffering, the deepest truths about the human soul remain inaccessible. Suffering in consciousness. Dostoevsky believed that suffering is inseparable from consciousness. The more aware a person becomes of themselves, of others, of moral responsibility, the more vulnerable they are to pain. This idea is articulated explicitly in Notes from Underground, where the narrator argues that rational happiness and perfect social systems would destroy what makes us human. A world without suffering would be a world without depth, without freedom, without genuine choice. The Underground man insists that humans will choose pain over harmony if harmony threatens their sense of individuality. Why? Because suffering confirms existence. It proves that one is not a machine, not a calculation, not a predictable outcome of rational design. In Dostoevsky's universe, pain is evidence of inner life, voluntary versus involuntary suffering. Not all suffering is redemptive in Dostoevsky's thought. This distinction is crucial. There is suffering imposed by cruelty, injustice, or meaningless violence. Dostoevsky condemns this without hesitation, especially when it involves the innocent, particularly children. No philosophy, no future utopia, no abstract good can justify such suffering. But there is another kind, voluntary suffering. This is suffering that arises when a person accepts responsibility, confronts guilt, or refuses to escape the consequences of their actions. It is not chosen for its own sake, but embraced as the price of truth. Raskolnikov's journey in Crime and Punishment is the clearest example. After committing murder, Raskolnikov attempts to avoid suffering. He rationalizes the crime. He hides behind ideology. He tells himself the act was necessary, justified, even noble, but his mind and body revolt. Fever, paranoia, isolation, and inner torment consume him. What destroys Raskolnikov is not the law. It is unacknowledged guilt. Only when he confesses, when he accepts punishment, when he walks willingly into suffering, does the possibility of transformation emerge. Dostoevsky is explicit. Redemption begins not with escape, but with acceptance, the refusal of easy consolation. One reason Dostoevsky remains disturbing is that he refuses to offer easy consolation. He does not tell us that suffering will always make us stronger, wiser, or better. Sometimes it breaks people. Sometimes it deforms them. Sometimes it leads to bitterness, cruelty, or despair. And yet, he insists, it cannot simply be bypassed. Modern culture often treats suffering as a design flaw in existence. Dostoevsky treats it as a revelation. Pain exposes what comfort conceals: pride, selfishness, fear, dependence, and the limits of reason. This is why so many of his characters resist happiness when it threatens to feel shallow or false. They mistrust joy that is not passed through suffering. Prince Mishkin, in The Idiot, embodies this paradox. His compassion, innocence, and openness are born not from ignorance, but from illness, vulnerability, and humiliation. He does not conquer the world through strength. He exposes its cruelty by refusing to protect himself from it. Mishkin's suffering does not save others, but it reveals them. Suffering and moral awakening. For Dostoevsky, suffering is often the moment when moral awareness becomes unavoidable. Before suffering, human beings can live in abstraction. They can discuss ethics, justice, and responsibility as intellectual exercises. They can justify almost anything. But suffering collapses abstraction. Pain makes morality personal, immediate, inescapable. Ivan Karamazov's philosophical rebellion against God and the Brothers Karamazov is not built on abstract logic alone. It is grounded in stories of real suffering, especially the torture of children. Ivan does not deny God's existence. He rejects a moral universe that allows innocent suffering. And yet, Ivan himself cannot escape suffering. His refusal to accept responsibility, his insistence on intellectual distance, leads him into madness. His ideas turn inward and consume him. Dostoevsky seems to suggest that suffering cannot be outsourced. If one refuses to carry moral responsibility, it will return in distorted, destructive forms. The failure of utopian thinking. One of Dostoevsky's most prophetic insights is his critique of utopian systems that promise to eliminate suffering through rational organization. He foresaw that any system designed to remove pain entirely would require the removal of freedom. Human unpredictability, moral struggle, and inner conflict would have to be engineered out of existence. The result would not be paradise, but something closer to spiritual suffocation. In The Grand Inquisitor, Christ is condemned not because he failed, but because he gave humanity freedom instead of comfort. The Inquisitor argues that people do not want truth. They want relief from suffering. They want bread, security, and certainty, even if it costs them their souls. Dostoevsky's response is uncompromising. A world without suffering may be orderly, but it would not be human. Suffering as the price of freedom. Freedom, in Dostoevsky's vision, inevitably entails suffering. To be free means to choose. To choose means to risk error. To risk error means to suffer consequences. There is no moral growth without the possibility of failure, guilt, and regret. This is why attempts to abolish suffering often lead to tyranny. If people are not allowed to suffer, they must not be allowed to choose. Dostoevsky understood this long before totalitarian regimes made it obvious. He saw that the desire to escape pain could become the strongest justification for control. If suffering is the greatest evil, then any authority promising to eliminate it becomes irresistible. And yet, such authority must eventually destroy the human spirit. The dark comfort of suffering. Another unsettling idea in Dostoevsky's work is that humans sometimes cling to suffering. This is not because suffering is pleasant, but because it provides meaning when nothing else does. The underground man admits that pain gives him a sense of identity. It confirms his inner life. It allows him to resist being absorbed into a rational system that defines happiness for him. This insight anticipates modern psychology. Humans do not always seek pleasure. They seek significance. And when meaning is absent, suffering can become a substitute. Dostoevsky does not romanticize this tendency, but he recognizes it as deeply human, redemption without guarantees. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of Dostoevsky's philosophy of suffering is that redemption is never guaranteed. Suffering does not automatically save anyone. It only creates the conditions in which truth becomes unavoidable. Some characters respond to suffering with humility and repentance. Others respond with resentment and cruelty. The difference lies not in the amount of pain endured, but in the willingness to accept responsibility. This is why Dostoevsky refuses to turn suffering into a formula. There is no moral algorithm, no promise that pain will be worth it. There's only the possibility. Why this still matters. In a culture increasingly uncomfortable with discomfort, Dostoevsky's insistence on suffering feels profoundly countercultural. He does not tell us to seek pain. He tells us not to flee from it at any cost, not to anesthetize ourselves with distraction, ideology, or false optimism, because some truths can only be learned when illusions fail. Some depths can only be reached when the surface collapses. Dostoevsky leaves us with an unsettling question. If suffering cannot be eliminated without destroying freedom, and if truth cannot be reached without suffering, what kind of life are we actually trying to build? This question does not offer comfort, but it offers honesty. And in Dostoevsky's world, that may be the highest form of respect one can give to the human soul. Freedom as a burden, not a gift. Modern culture treats freedom as the highest good. Freedom is presented as liberation from rules, from limits, from tradition, from responsibility. The more options we have, the freer we believe ourselves to be. The fewer constraints placed upon us, the closer we think we are to fulfillment. Dostoevsky did not share this optimism. For him, freedom was not a reward. It was a test, and often a burden too heavy for human beings to carry. Again and again in his novels, Dostoevsky returns to a disturbing observation. People do not simply fear oppression. They fear freedom itself. Freedom and the weight of choice. To be free is not merely to act without restraint. It is to choose and to bear responsibility for what follows. Every genuine choice excludes alternatives. Every decision creates consequences, and every consequence demands accountability. Dostoevsky understood that this is precisely what makes freedom terrifying. In Notes from Underground, the narrator rebels against rational systems that promise happiness. But his rebellion is not heroic. It is bitter, self-destructive, and often absurd. He clings to freedom not because it makes him happy, but because it allows him to say no, even when saying no ruins his life. Why? Because freedom affirms personhood. To lose freedom is to become predictable. To become predictable is to become replaceable. And to become replaceable is to lose one's sense of self. Dostoevsky suggests that human beings would rather suffer freely than be happy under coercion. Yet, and this is crucial, they do not always endure the cost of that freedom well. The Grand Inquisitor, Freedom Rejected. No passage captures Dostoevsky's view of freedom more powerfully than the Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov. Here, Christ returns to earth and is immediately imprisoned, not because he failed, but because he gave humanity too much freedom. The Inquisitor accuses Christ of a terrible mistake, refusing to turn stones into bread, refusing to rule by miracle, mystery, and authority. By doing so, Christ left humanity alone with its freedom, and humanity, the Inquisitor claims, could not bear it. People want certainty instead of doubt, security instead of responsibility, obedience instead of moral struggle. They want to be told what is good, what is evil and what must be done, so they no longer have to decide for themselves. Freedom demands inner strength. Most people, Dostoevsky suggests, do not possess it. Freedom and moral collapse. When freedom is detached from moral responsibility, it does not elevate humanity. It dissolves it. This is a central theme in Demons, the Possessed, where radical freedom becomes an excuse for nihilism, manipulation, and violence. Characters proclaim liberation from all moral limits, yet their freedom produces only chaos, cruelty, and emptiness. They are free from God, free from tradition, free from obligation, but they are not free from themselves. Without moral grounding, freedom turns inward and devours the individual. What begins as liberation becomes fragmentation. The self splinters under the weight of unanchored choice. Dostoevsky foresaw what modern history would later confirm. Freedom without responsibility does not lead to dignity. It leads to disintegration, the desire to surrender freedom. Perhaps Dostoevsky's most unsettling insight is this. Human beings often want to give up their freedom, not because they are weak, but because freedom is exhausting. Freedom means no final authority to blame, no external system to hide behind, no guarantee that one's choices are correct. To be free is to stand alone with one's conscience. And conscience, in Dostoevsky's world, is relentless. This is why authoritarian figures are so appealing. They promise relief, not just from suffering, but from responsibility. They offer structure, purpose, and permission to obey. Dostoevsky understood that tyranny rarely arrives by force alone. It is invited. Freedom as a spiritual trial. For Dostoevsky, freedom is not primarily political. It is spiritual. Freedom reveals what a person truly values. It exposes motives. It strips away excuses. Given freedom, some choose love and responsibility. Others choose domination, escape, or self-destruction. There is no neutral outcome. This is why freedom, in Dostoevsky's vision, is inseparable from moral risk. To be free is to risk choosing evil. But to remove that risk is to remove humanity itself. The paradox of freedom. Dostoevsky presents a paradox that modern thinking often avoids. Freedom does not make us good. Freedom makes goodness possible. Without freedom, virtue has no meaning. Obedience enforced by fear or design is not moral action, it is programming. Yet freedom also makes evil possible. This is the unbearable tension at the heart of human existence. And Dostoevsky refuses to resolve it. Instead, he insists that any attempt to escape this tension through ideology, authority, or comfort leads to spiritual death. Why freedom feels heavier than chains. Chains are external. Freedom is internal. External constraints can be blamed. Internal choices cannot. Dostoevsky understood that modern individuals, stripped of tradition and transcendent meaning, would experience freedom not as joy, but as anxiety. Too many choices, too little guidance, too much responsibility. This anxiety, he predicted, would drive people back toward systems that promise certainty, even at the cost of liberty. History proved him right. Freedom and love. In Dostoevsky's moral universe, freedom finds its highest expression not in independence, but in chosen responsibility toward others. Love is meaningful precisely because it is free. Sacrifice matters because it is not enforced. Alyosha Karamazov embodies this ideal, not through dominance or certainty, but through voluntary compassion. He does not escape freedom. He accepts it and directs it toward others. This is Dostoevsky's quiet answer to the problem of freedom. Freedom becomes bearable only when it is used for love. An uncomfortable conclusion. Dostoevsky does not reassure us that freedom will make us happy. He warns us that it will test us. Freedom exposes weakness before it reveals strength. It demands maturity before it grants dignity. And most disturbingly, it reveals that many of our longings for order, authority, certainty are not signs of wisdom, but fear. Dostoevsky leaves us with a question that remains painfully relevant. If freedom is so heavy and responsibility so frightening, what kind of person must we become to be worthy of it? The danger of abstract ideas. Dostoevsky was deeply suspicious of ideas, not because ideas lack power, but because they possess too much of it. Ideas shape how we see the world, how we justify our actions, and how we define good and evil. They give meaning to suffering and direction to history. But Dostoevsky understood something that many intellectuals overlook. Ideas become dangerous the moment they detach from concrete human reality. In his novels, the most catastrophic actions are rarely driven by greed or hatred alone. They are driven by ideas, clean, elegant, rational ideas that promise progress, justice, or liberation. And when an idea becomes more important than a human life, Dostoevsky believed disaster is inevitable. Ideas versus human beings. Dostoevsky did not oppose thinking. He opposed thinking that replaces human beings with abstractions. An abstract idea simplifies reality. It reduces complexity. It compresses messy, contradictory human experience into a single principle. This makes the world easier to manage, but less human. Once a person begins to think in abstractions, individuals become symbols. Lives become examples. Suffering becomes a statistic or a necessary cost. Dostoevsky's warning is blunt. The more perfect an idea appears, the more ruthless it can become. Raskolnikov and the murder of an idea. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov does not kill for money. He kills to test an idea. He believes humanity is divided into ordinary people who must obey the law and extraordinary individuals who may transgress it for a higher purpose. Napoleon becomes his model, not as a man, but as a concept. The murder is meant to prove that Raskolnikov belongs to the latter category. What Dostoevsky reveals is devastating. The idea collapses the moment it touches reality. The victim is not a theoretical obstacle. She is a human being. Her death is not clean or heroic. It is chaotic, ugly, and irreversible. Raskolnikov's suffering begins precisely because reality refuses to conform to theory. His conscience rebels, not against murder as an abstraction, but against the concrete fact of a life taken. The idea fails because it does not understand the human soul. Intellectual pride and moral blindness. Dostoevsky was particularly critical of intellectual pride, the belief that superior reasoning grants moral exemption. Characters who believe themselves intellectually enlightened often display profound ethical blindness. Their logic is impeccable. Their compassion is absent. Ivan Karamazov is the most sophisticated example. Ivan's rebellion against God is intellectually compelling. He does not deny God's existence. He rejects a world that allows innocent suffering. His argument is built on moral outrage, not cruelty. And yet, Ivan's refusal to accept responsibility for the moral consequences of his ideas destroys him. He claims that if God does not exist, everything is permitted, but refuses to accept what that permission entails. His ideas, once spoken, take on a life of their own. Others act on them. Ivan bears the guilt, even as he denies it. Dostoevsky's message is merciless. Ideas do not absolve their creators. Demons, when ideas possess people. In Demons, Dostoevsky presents his most explicit warning about ideology. The characters are not driven by personal ambition or material gain. They are possessed by revolutionary ideas. Ideas that promise to tear down old structures and build a perfect future. But no one can clearly describe this future. The present, however, is destroyed with precision. Murder, betrayal, manipulation, and psychological domination are justified in the name of progress. Individuals become expendable. Loyalty to the idea replaces loyalty to human beings. Dostoevsky foresaw something terrifying. Once an idea becomes sacred, human life becomes disposable. This is not fanaticism born of ignorance. It is fanaticism born of intellect detached from conscience, the seduction of moral arithmetic. One of the most dangerous aspects of abstract thinking is what Dostoevsky implicitly critiques as moral arithmetic. The belief that suffering can be calculated, balanced, and justified by outcomes. If one death leads to 1,000 saved, is it acceptable? If temporary cruelty produces long-term happiness, is it moral? Dostoevsky's answer is unequivocal. No calculation can justify the deliberate destruction of a human soul. This is why Ivan Karamazov rejected a universe built on the suffering of children, even if it ends in eternal harmony. The cost is too high. The calculation itself is immoral. Dostoevsky exposes a flaw in utilitarian thinking. It treats individuals as means rather than ends. And once that line is crossed, there is no natural stopping point. Abstract good versus concrete love. Dostoevsky contrasts abstract morality with concrete love. Abstract good speaks in principles. Concrete love speaks in responsibility. Abstract good asks, what is best for humanity? Concrete love asks, what do I owe this person? Characters like Sonia, Alyosha, and Prince Mishkin do not argue philosophy. They act. They suffer with others. They accept humiliation and sacrifice without justification. Their morality is not efficient, but it is human. Dostoevsky suggests that ethical truth is not discovered through deduction, but through relationship. Why intelligent people are especially dangerous. Dostoevsky feared not ignorance, but intelligence without humility. The more intelligent a person is, the more capable they are constructing rationalizations. The clearer the logic, the easier it becomes to silence conscience. This is why some of his most destructive characters are highly articulate. They can explain evil convincingly. They can frame cruelty as necessity. Dostoevsky anticipated a modern phenomenon, atrocities justified not by hatred, but by paperwork, language, and theory, ideas and the death of personal responsibility. Abstract ideas allow individuals to outsource responsibility. I was following history. I was serving progress. I was acting for the greater good. Dostoevsky exposes this as moral cowardice. No idea, he insists, can bear guilt. Only people can. The moment responsibility is transferred to a system or concept, moral accountability dissolves. Evil becomes impersonal and therefore limitless. The psychological cost of living in abstractions. Living inside ideas damages the psyche. Characters consumed by ideology often display emotional detachment, instability, and inner emptiness. Their inner lives shrink as their intellectual frameworks expand. Reality intrudes through guilt, suffering, and contradiction, but the individual resists, clinging to theory even as it destroys them. Dostoevsky shows that the human mind cannot survive indefinitely in abstraction. The soul demands recognition, a warning to the modern world. Dostoevsky's critique feels unsettlingly modern. We live in an age saturated with ideology, data, and moral narratives that reduce human beings to categories. Political, economic, and cultural systems promise solutions, but often at the cost of individual dignity. Dostoevsky does not offer a counter-ideology. He offers a warning. Whenever an idea claims moral superiority without compassion, whenever a system demands sacrifice without accountability, whenever theory replaces empathy, something essential is being lost. Dostoevsky's uncomfortable conclusion. Dostoevsky does not argue that ideas are evil. He argues that ideas without love are lethal. Truth, in his world, is not something one possesses. It is something one bears through responsibility, humility, and suffering. Ideas must kneel before human life, not the other way around. And the moment they refuse to kneel, they become instruments of destruction, no matter how noble their intentions. Dostoevsky leaves us with a question that remains urgent. How many evils have been committed not by hatred, but by people who believe they were right? Psychological depth before modern psychology. Long before psychology became a formal discipline, long before Freud named the unconscious or Jung spoke of the shadow, Dostoevsky was already exploring the darkest and most contradictory regions of the human mind. He did not approach the psyche as a system to be mapped. He approached it as a battlefield. In Dostoevsky's novels, the mind is never unified, stable, or transparent to itself. Human beings do not fully understand why they act. They lie to others and, more dangerously, to themselves. Motives conflict. Desires contradict values. Guilt emerges before crime is consciously acknowledged. Dostoevsky understood something essential. The human psyche is not governed by reason alone. The divided self. One of Dostoevsky's most consistent psychological insights is that the self is divided. People are not singular wills pursuing coherent goals. They are collections of impulses, fears, resentments, hopes, and contradictions, often pulling in opposite directions. Characters routinely act against their own interests. They sabotage relationships they crave. They provoke humiliation they claim to despise. They destroy what they love. This is not poor character construction. It is psychological realism. Dostoevsky shows that the self is not a rational manager, but a fragile negotiation between competing inner forces, conscious reason and unconscious motives. Dostoevsky repeatedly exposes a gap between what characters say motivates them and what actually does. Raskolnikov insists his murder is philosophical. The underground man insists his bitterness is intellectual honesty. Stavrogin insists his detachment is freedom. But beneath these explanations lies something else. Wounded pride, fear of insignificance, craving for power, desire to assert existence. Dostoevsky reveals that rational explanations often function as defenses, not truths. They protect the ego from confronting vulnerability and shame. This insight predates psychoanalysis by decades. Guilt before crime. One of Dostoevsky's most striking psychological observations is that guilt often precedes wrongdoing. Characters experience anxiety, paranoia, and self-loathing before committing overt acts of evil. Crime becomes an expression of an already fractured inner state, not its origin. Raskolnikov is tormented long before the murder. The act itself merely externalizes an internal collapse. The crime does not create guilt. It gives guilt a form. Dostoevsky understood that moral transgression is rarely sudden. It grows slowly, nourished by resentment, isolation, and unacknowledged self-contempt. The need for punishment. Perhaps Dostoevsky's most disturbing insight is this. Human beings sometimes seek punishment, not consciously, but psychologically. When guilt remains unresolved, the psyche searches for release. Suffering becomes a way to restore moral balance. Punishment offers clarity where denial produces chaos. This is why so many characters provoke their own downfall. They confess unnecessarily. They behave recklessly. They leave traces. Dostoevsky suggests that the soul cannot indefinitely endure unacknowledged guilt. If justice does not arrive from outside, it will be manufactured from within. Masochism and the pleasure of pain. Dostoevsky does not shy away from an uncomfortable truth. People can derive a strange satisfaction from suffering. The underground man admits that pain gives him pleasure, not because it feels good, but because it intensifies self-awareness. Suffering confirms existence. This is not pathology alone. It is a distorted search for meaning. When dignity, love, or purpose feel unattainable, pain becomes a substitute. It is better to suffer intensely than to feel nothing at all. Dostoevsky's characters cling to humiliation. because it proves they still feel, still exist, still matter. Self-deception and moral rationalization. Dostoevsky was acutely aware of humanity's capacity for self-deception. Characters construct elaborate narratives to justify their behavior. They redefine cruelty as honesty, selfishness as independence, cowardice as realism. The danger lies not in ignorance, but in intelligence. The sharper the intellect, the more convincing the rationalization. Dostoevsky shows that moral collapse rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as clarity. Isolation and psychological breakdown. Isolation plays a central role in Dostoevsky's psychology. Cut off from genuine human connection, characters lose the ability to test their inner narratives against reality. Thoughts loop endlessly. Resentment intensifies. Imagination replaces truth. The mind turns inward and becomes hostile. Dostoevsky anticipates modern understandings of mental illness. Loneliness does not merely hurt, it distorts perception. This is why confession, dialogue, and relationship are so crucial in his novels. They break the closed system of the self, the shadow self. Although Dostoevsky never used the term, his work is saturated with what modern psychology would call the shadow, the repressed, denied, or disowned aspects of the self. Characters who refuse to acknowledge their darker impulses become possessed by them. What is denied internally returns externally, often in destructive form. Ivan's ideas manifest as violence. Stavrogin's emptiness becomes corruption. Raskolnikov's pride becomes murder. Dostoevsky insists that ignoring the shadow does not eliminate it. It strengthens it. Compassion as psychological healing. Dostoevsky does not reduce psychology to pathology. He shows that healing begins not with insight alone, but with compassion, received and given. Sonia's quiet presence does more for Raskolnikov than any argument. Alyosha's listening softens hardened souls. Love interrupts isolation. Dostoevsky anticipates a truth modern therapy would later articulate. The psyche heals in relationship. Why Dostoevsky still matters psychologically. Dostoevsky's characters feel disturbingly modern because the inner conflicts he described have not disappeared. We still rationalize. We still sabotage ourselves. We still seek meaning through suffering. We still fear self-knowledge. Dostoevsky offers no technique, no treatment plan. He offers recognition. He shows us ourselves, not as we wish to be, but as we are when no one is watching. An unsettling insight. Perhaps Dostoevsky's greatest psychological insight is this. The greatest danger to the human psyche is not pain, but denial. Denial of guilt. Denial of responsibility. Denial of inner conflict. Truth hurts, but falsehood corrodes. Dostoevsky leaves us with a question that cuts uncomfortably close. If you were forced to confront your deepest motives, without excuses, without abstractions, what would you discover? Faith is a choice, not a proof. Dostoevsky never tried to prove God. This alone sets him apart from both theologians and philosophers. He does not offer logical demonstrations, metaphysical arguments, or empirical evidence for faith. In fact, he openly acknowledges that faith cannot be proven without destroying its essence. For Dostoevsky, belief is not the result of certainty. It is the result of a choice. And that choice is made not in clarity, but in doubt, suffering, and moral risk. Faith in a world that allows suffering. The central problem Dostoevsky wrestles with is not whether God exists, but whether God is acceptable. Ivan Karamazov's rebellion does not deny God. It accuses him. Ivan cannot accept a world in which innocent children suffer. No future harmony, no final justice, no eternal reward can justify their pain. If such a world is the price of divine order, Ivan returns his ticket. This is one of the most powerful moral arguments ever written against religious belief. And Dostoevsky does not refute it. He lets it stand, fully honestly, without dilution. This is crucial. Dostoevsky does not silence doubt. He gives it its strongest voice. The collapse of rational faith. Dostoevsky understood that rational faith is unstable. If belief depends entirely on logic, then it collapses the moment logic encounters contradiction. And reality is full of contradiction, especially suffering that appears meaningless. Faith built on proof demands a world that behaves rationally, but the world does not. This is why Dostoevsky believed that attempts to rationalize faith ultimately destroy it. A God who must be logically justified becomes a concept, not a presence, and concepts cannot love. Faith as moral commitment. In Dostoevsky's universe, faith is not primarily metaphysical, it is ethical. To believe is not merely to accept propositions about God. It is to commit oneself to a way of being in the world. Faith means choosing. Responsibility over resentment. Love over moral calculation. Humility over intellectual pride. This is why Alyosha Karamazov's faith looks nothing like Ivan's arguments. Alyosha does not debate. He listens. He serves. He remains present in the suffering of others. His belief is not certainty. It is fidelity. The risk of belief. Dostoevsky insists that faith is risky. To believe is to act as if love matters, even when evidence suggests otherwise. To believe is to forgive, even when justice feels more satisfying. To believe is to accept responsibility, even when blame would be easier. There are no guarantees. Faith does not shield believers from suffering. It exposes them to it. This is why faith, for Dostoevsky, cannot be imposed. Coerced belief is meaningless. Enforced faith produces obedience, not transformation. Only freely chosen belief has moral weight. Christ is a moral ideal, not a system. Dostoevsky's Christ is not a ruler, a lawgiver, or an architect of institutions. He is a moral ideal. Christ refuses power, refuses domination, refuses to eliminate suffering through force. This is precisely why the Grand Inquisitor condemns him. Christ trusts human freedom, even knowing it will be misused. He offers love without guarantees of success. He accepts rejection rather than compel obedience. Dostoevsky presents this as the ultimate moral gamble. Faith versus ideology. Faith, in Dostoevsky's view, stands in opposition to ideology. Ideology promises certainty. Faith accepts uncertainty. Ideology justifies sacrifice. Faith absorbs it. Ideology speaks in abstractions. Faith responds to faces. This is why Dostoevsky feared secular ideologies that replace God with systems. When faith is replaced by ideology, moral responsibility dissolves into obedience. Faith keeps the burden personal, the freedom to reject faith. Perhaps Dostoevsky's most radical position is that faith must include the freedom to reject it. God does not compel belief. Truth does not overpower doubt. Love does not coerce. This means atheism, rebellion, and doubt are not failures of faith. They are conditions of its possibility. A faith that cannot be rejected is not faith at all. Why faith is a choice. In Dostoevsky's world, belief happens at the edge of despair. It emerges when reason reaches its limits, when suffering cannot be justified, when meaning cannot be guaranteed. At that edge, one must choose, not between proof and error, but between two ways of living, resentment or responsibility, withdrawal or engagement, despair or love. Faith does not explain suffering. It responds to it. The final risk. Dostoevsky does not promise that faith will save the world. He suggests only that without it, something essential may be lost, the belief that love has ultimate significance, even when history says otherwise. Faith, then, is not optimism. It is courage, the courage to live as if one's actions matter, as if responsibility cannot be outsourced, as if love is worth the cost. Dostoevsky's unanswered question. Dostoevsky ends where philosophy usually begins. He does not conclude. He does not resolve the tension. He leaves us with a question that cannot be answered theoretically. In a world that does not guarantee justice, that allows innocent suffering, that offers no final proof, how will you choose to live? That choice, Dostoevsky suggests, is the truest expression of faith there is.